Welcome, everybody. It's the third week of New York Textile Month, and which is a celebration of textiles of all kinds. We've had a month long of events, mostly digital, some in person. New York Textile Month is an event founded by trend forecaster and Dean of Hybrid Studies, Lee Edelcourt. We're in our fifth year now, and this year we produced a platform called Textile TV, which is a series of conversations with leaders in art, design, and textiles. I'm your host for today. I'm Sagarika Sundaram, deputy editor of Talking Textiles, which is a publication we put out annually. Today, I'm so delighted to welcome Peter Koepke, owner and director of the Design Library, which is an incredible space up in Hudson Valley. It's a directory, is a repository which physically houses over 7 million original design references that they license out to designers and the industry. It was founded in 1972, and it's housed in a former textile mill. And I've had the pleasure of visiting this amazing space. It's, high ceilings, sunlit rooms, long wooden tables, metal shelves stacked with fabric swatches, pattern books, embroidery, wallpaper. It's infinitely inspiring. And it's the design libraries, the fashion and textile industry's best kept secret. Um, Today, Peter's going to take us through the library and tell us about his own journey and share some case studies of how the design library functions like a portal between past and present, connecting designers like Sonia Delaunay and Frank Lloyd Wright with organizations like Nike and Lululemon. Today, over 10,000 designers access the library every year. And today, we will have all of you, in a way, coming by for a visit. Thank you so much for joining us, Peter. So happy to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here, Sagarika, and everyone else who's tuned in. It's an advantage, Paul. If there is an opportunity buried anywhere in this pandemic, it's that we get to do more things like this. But just a quick overview of, I guess I should share the screen, should I? Okay, we do that first?
Yes. So the green button.
Now this one. Coming. And I believe it's there.
Yes.
Okay.
And I just wanted to let everybody know that you can toggle the size of the, what you have on screen, whether it's the presentation or whose face you have. So feel free to do that and set yourself up.
So the beginning of, it's not advancing. Here we are. This is the entry of our space. We moved there 23 years ago from Broadway and 40th. The library was pretty much the size that you see there, only housed on 2 floors of 1435 Broadway. My desire was to move it up to the Hudson Valley, which is where I was with raising my family and enjoying life. And so this was an opportunity, and we moved there. And it's been 23 years. To my amazement, it's become a bit of a pilgrimage. People come up when it's easier to travel. They come on the Metro North train. We pick them up and they come and join us at the space. We also have a London office. It's a much smaller, but it's well-chosen, highly curated office in central London. So it's sort of the opposite setup. This is what we call the sort of mother lode of designs. It houses 7 million designs, categorized in many ways for the use of the professional designer. So we're not like a museum. We don't have things chronologically or necessarily historically, but we have them by style, motif, by the way that a designer would want to find a solution for what they're designing next. We're looking at stacks and stacks of Bianchini Ferrier, which is a collection we'll talk about a little later, but they're paper impressions there. These are silks, hanging silks, many from Bianchini and Staron. They're great French mills from the late 19th and throughout the 20th century. I can explain a little bit more about our categorizing system, but we've been fortunate to be able to acquire for 50 years now. The founder of the library was Susan Meller, who's written 4 beautiful books, and now lives in Berkeley, California, and continues to write and research. She's a great textile scholar. I admire her work very much, and I was happy to join the company almost 30 years ago now. Quite hard to believe. This is about how did I get there, right, Sagarika?
That was going to be my first question, which is,
Sorry.
This is such a unique place, home to over 7 million patterns, and you used to trade in South American tribal art and artifacts. How did you end up in this business? Tell us a bit about your story.
Well, as I was young and footloose, in my 20s and 30s, I spent a lot of time in the Amazon of South America. And of course, there's a great textile tradition there, as well as pottery and the application of patterns. So this is a backstrap loom from a woman in the upper Ucayali River, hugely ambitious, with warps going that far across the yard to the house next door.
Wow.
This is hand spun cotton that they harvest there and grow, and essentially only creating canvas. There's very little design woven in. It's a canvas to paint on. And so I basically fell in love with this area, with the idea of pattern, with the way that pattern is an emblem of who we believe we are and the cultures that we are part of. This is their patterns before people even wore clothes were often painted on their skin. And obviously there's a trend going back to that now. I'm not giving up the clothes, but getting tattoos. So this isn't a typical shipibo pattern on a young woman's face, and they would put it on their arms and legs and everywhere. In fact, at some point, the entire culture, all the material culture was covered in this type of design. They're great potters. You can see the design is carried over into this lady's skirt. So the pottery is coil built and then hand painted. And in this case, a finished textile was so admired by the family that I was traveling with that Erlinda is copying the design on a piece of paper so she can remember and use it again later. I had great years traveling up and down the river, visiting villages, living with people there, and collecting the art. The art came to the States, to Europe, all over the world. Mostly the pieces that I collected would not survive in the wild for more than about 10 or 15 years. And many of them are still here in museums now. So the segue from that to the library, this is a finished piece of pottery, by the way. Mm-hmm. And mm-hmm. Pattern is everywhere. And it's a kind of a delineation of who they are. Mm-hmm. This is a picture from the design library. And the far left is a shipibo design from the Amazon. Mm-hmm. The next one is a 1950s French design. Then we have a Frank Lloyd Wright, and then a French 19th century blue resist, and then a very old 18th century American blue resist on the far right. And they make a sort of pattern, a nice show together, and it shows how diverse a collection can be and still make sense together. So it was easy for me to make the move, basically.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you've been honing your eye and your taste for many years before you were in this business directly.
I suppose, yes, yeah. It's a lot of exposure to a lot of design, and kind of feeling taken in by it. Sort of, I was bewitched by it in some way.
So your job at the Design Library, in a nutshell, is to open your vast library of designs and in new and accessible ways to designers. And part of this job is, you come up with, you invent design categories, new ones. Can you tell us a little bit about these categories and some of your favorite ones, maybe?
Sure, sure. First of all, I'll talk about 3 layers of design categories. In the main archive, which is the one that people visit, and everything is analog, so all 7 million pieces are actually there, or minus the ones that are in London at any given time. It's organized with 1,200 categories in 4 principal families: floral, geometric, ethnic, and conversational. The 1,200 categories then are within those are also collections that are of great importance, so they don't get broken up like Ducharme and Bianchini Ferrier and Giorgio Taroni. They get sorted in their own fashion, so there'll be another 50 ways to do it. Some of my favorites are Fauvist, which is about 1905, the time of Matisse and Raoul Dufy, one of my favorite categories. It's kind of it's the birth of modernity. So it's the very dawn of the 20th century, and it's known for very saturated, completely unrealistic color palettes. And this is a very powerful example of a Fauvist painting. Another one of my favorites is Oberkamp. So it's the other end of the spectrum. It's from the 1700s, and it's the first textile printing business in the south of France. These are basically woodblock tests on paper, which were done before they went to fabric. These things they were made when America was not even a country yet, look extremely chic and extremely modern even today. So I kind of range from the modern, the 20th century, to the very early. And I love Japanese designs. So this is a great collection of blue resists. We've collected them for many years, for the whole 50 years of the, I was lucky enough to make one trip to Japan. So Japanese is something that we thrive on. Then another layer, so the 1,200 categories Cosmos is our digital archive, and it has 130 keywords and attributes, and we were able to add, because it is online, moods and colors and more ways to see things. In those 130 words, we got to add things like fun and playful, edgy and fast, high tech and industrial, which don't exactly work in the main library. They work because the same design can appear in more than one place. And if we only have one example of a design, which is the case, it's always in one location in the analog world. In the digital world, it gets to appear in different places based on what you've asked for. Mm-hmm. This is the development of Cosmos, which we spent about 10 years on. And this is how the browser works. So people can search either visually or verbally. So if you like a design, any one of these, and click it, it becomes your selected one, and the screen populates with hundreds of similar designs that are all there. We're over 20,000 designs there now with keywords and searchable capabilities, driven by the visuals or by verbal, whichever your mood is that day. This has been a huge help during the pandemic because people can work from home. So that's the Cosmos level. And then the book patterns inside the design library, which is Phaidon Press. Thank you.
Yeah, which you sent me.
The publisher and we agreed, it was great fun to work with Phaidon, that we would do an A to Z. So we'd show the sort of infinite ability, the infinite size of textile designs, how deep it is. It's like music and literature. It's essentially unlimited. So to do an A to Z, we had to have a category for each letter of the alphabet, and we did some with doubles and even a triple, I think. So we wound up with 39 categories, and we were able to add really fun things like bling. We put, that's bling, and there might be 8 or 10 blings in the book, but this is a beauty.
Mhm.
Chaos, we put next to chintz.
Mhm.
So chaos is not a normal category, chintz is, but we were able to make it part of the book and make it a more interesting book. We put Gothic next to gentle in the G, of course. We invented a category called quotidian, and it's just everyday stuff. And jazzy, which was one of my favorite categories, was an invented category too, but it was very easy to see jazzy designs in textiles that just made sense that way.
I just want to give everybody a sense of what this book is. And it's a book published that Peter published, and it's a directory of designs and patterns that organized alphabetically in all of these different categories. And so you have exotica and bling and gentle, and they're in alphabetical order. So Peter is taking us through some of his categories.
And in order to satisfy X, it was hard. So that we had to do X rated, and it did satisfy it. And there were very few designs in the archive of the world that could be classified that, and probably from the 70s and the kind of the disco days. This, go ahead, Sagarika, you're next.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just curious, we've discussed this in previous conversations. When you research patterns and designs, what makes the cut? You've said in the past that just because something is old doesn't mean it's good. So and you also, as you go through these designs, some you say are strong. What is a good pattern for you and what makes the cut?
Wow, fascinating question. I think if it's, well, some styles of designs move through time and space more easily than others. There's certain time periods and types that are just stuck where they were, and they're not easy to interpret again for anyone. It just, they are what they are. But many, many things do move. So first of all, I would pay attention to that. Is this something that I could see being used by anyone in the next 20 years? It doesn't have to be on trend today at all. The next thing is, for what it is it a good example of what it is? Is this collection, usually these are vast collections from old mills that have kept them, or, in swatch books and so on, that people have forgotten they had, or the business is closed for a long time and the grandchildren realize they've got something there that is valuable. So is it if it's Art Deco, is it good Art Deco or is it not so good Art Deco? And so that's the next thing. And I know that when I first started 30 years ago, nobody wanted to see any Art Deco, for example. Art Deco and Art Nouveau, anything identifiable as an art movement or a style wasn't desirable. But we bought, well, it just wasn't in fashion. I'm not sure why. It just was too somehow retro in people's minds. I'm not sure. But basically we bought it anyway. Every time there was a beautiful collection, and then the world came around years later and loves Art Deco. It's been used a great deal. So I think that exposure, when I talked about Amazonian art, and I think it's the same with textiles, that all of us, any of us can become connoisseurs if we want to, if we just have the desire to discern, and if we get exposed to a lot of material. So it isn't a great hidden mystery like being a super piano player. It can be learned if we care enough to say this is a really good thing, but then we have to see a lot as well.
And I mean, part of your job is, I mean, you obviously have a wealth of historical knowledge about visual history and culture. Tell me about what is the power of going into the past in order to interpret the future?
I think that everybody, often in the art world anyway, people are looking for new forms. But a very good painter friend of mine once said that everyone looks for new forms, but there are no new forms, just new images. And it's sort of like trying to reinvent the wheel, to sit down with a blank piece. I'm not saying some people don't do it, because I know that some of the creatives do it. But it's very difficult to have such a perfectly original idea without a reference point or a starting point. And so I think the power of having a historical repository is it saves people from needing to reinvent the wheel, which is already a good wheel. And it's so vast. Of course, it has to be organized, but it's so vast and so rich that it's a fountain of inspiration for people. It's also easier to choose something that one likes. If you see 1,000 designs and you need 5, it's much easier for a designer to choose 5 that they want to produce out of 1,000 than to choose 5 out of 8. And the outcome will always be better with more choice. And to draw that many things to choose from would be almost impossible. It's hard these days. People don't have the time, and they don't necessarily have the skill set to sit down and draw. Some do, but not so many anymore.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So it's a resource. It's like, I mean, some of the great paintings from the 1880s that we have, 1880s and 1890s, were made in Paris mainly. Big, voluptuous florals, beautiful things. The flower heads are almost directly taken from the old Dutch masters of hundreds of years before. So in fact, great ideas kind of moved through history.
And you're going to show us how that happens, how people go in a little bit. Right?
Yes. Yeah. Well, yes, I have examples of a couple of people, of clients who have said that it's okay for us to share how they work.
Mm-hmm.
One is Calvin Klein and one is Lululemon. So we'll get to that when you're ready. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about, your trips, and, can you tell us a more memorable story about a collection that you came upon and that was something very exciting for you?
Wow. In the acquisition side, I think the Bianchini Ferrier collection might be one of the most exciting ones. And that took about 2 years to get to the owner and get the attention of, and be convincing that we were serious and that we would, take good care of it, that we would pay enough for it. I mean, all of those things took time to achieve. And when it happened, it was some over 50,000 designs, maybe 35 or 40,000 in silk, and another 11,000 in paper impressions. And they're magnificent. I mean, they were the studio. It was run by Raoul Dufy in the early part of the 20th century, when he was a great fine artist, but for 12 years, he was the director of design for Bianchini. They co-branded with Dior and Givenchy and Yves Saint Laurent. They actually made pages of Vogue, French Vogue. We have some of the big pictures in the library. You may remember them, where it said Bianchini Ferrier and Dior, and they were presenting this design together. So those days were the golden days of Western Europe design, and Bianchini was one of the great companies. So I think that was a thrill. It took a long time. It was huge, packed. It was 40 big crates of designs and so on, but it was totally worth it. And we all love those designs, actually.
I mean, that's just an incredible partnership that you're just describing. I mean, I wonder what you think about, in today's fast fashion throwaway, like it's almost like patterns are sort of created quickly and have a short shelf life. What do you think, what is the role of pattern today? And how do you see it, what influence does it have on society?
Well, I think it helps us it helps us identify who we are on some level. In other words, if we go to a store with a rack of blouses or shirts, and half of them have pattern and half are plain, and we're drawn to a pattern. Why is that? And then our closets gradually fills up with some patterns, and then in the morning when we get up, we decide what to wear that day. I think part of that as well, what self do I want to project today? So it's kind of it's a cultural, it's a personal message about how we feel, about what we want to wear, whether it's going to be soft or edgy, that day. I think from a company's point of view, it defines their identity as well. So companies that are without pattern generally start to look a lot the same. I mean, I'm not trying to sell, but I think that pattern makes everything more interesting. And I think that it's a way that a company can tell people who they are and what they're feeling that year. Happily too, I think that the trend is a little bit away from fast fashion. I think people, particularly now, are looking for things that last longer, that are useful over long spans.
I mean, that brings me to my next question, which is how, inspiration travels from, source to final destination. Cultural appropriation is a topic that is on many people's minds, especially given our current political awakening about ownership and, cultures, sort of design sort of originating with certain cultures. And on one hand, you have people who believe that when a dominant culture is inspired by a non-dominant culture for commercial reasons, that's not okay. And on the other hand, you have a camp that see culture and inspiration as fluid and ever mingling and boundaryless. And that's the natural way of things, and given you're in the business of inspiration, where do you stand on this?
It's an important question. And I think from the years that I've been around it, I think that for anyone to create something without influence from other cultures is virtually impossible. In all directions. I think that over all time, I think there's a cross-semination over time and across geography from cultures to cultures. I think that this slide is a good segue. It's a Paisley. Paisleys, I'll actually take a little excerpt from my book, which is they were originated in Persia, which is today's Iran, exported from India in the 18th century, and named now after a town in Scotland that produced textiles in the 19th century. So this distinctive curving Paisley motif, it's worldly and well-traveled. The teardrop, pine cone, almond, modified yin-yang shape probably evolved from a stylized plant form. And it's, of course, gone all over the world. And that's the same thing has happened with ikat. Ikat has been made in so many countries in so many ways that we feel familiar with it. And here's a few other versions of Paisley that most likely started hundreds of years ago in Persia, got refined further in India, and then got a name from Scotland put on it because they had the manufacturing later in the 19th century. But there's a huge variety, all of which took something from that first kernel. So I guess the answer is, I don't think it's possible to avoid appropriation, some level of appropriation. I think that we at the Design Library in a particular and privileged position that we're in this sort of narrow part of the hourglass between past and future that you alluded to earlier. And also cultural things, designs pass through our hands. Our approach to being part of this whole issue is to try and raise consciousness, raise awareness by just fully disclosing where it came from, who made it, the full history of everything. That's not always the case with brands in the market, as you know. We're seeing it happen a little bit more. We're always volunteer to help write publicity or the hang tags. Certain companies are actually putting hang tags on garments now that explain where they came from. I think that's a huge consciousness raiser. I think that if I had a problem with anything, it would be letting the world believe that it's one's own when in fact it's from somewhere else. So the best thing to do is be transparent and disclose your inspiration. Not us. The design library doesn't care. We don't need or ask for any credit because we don't really deserve it. We're stewards. We're temporary guardians of a collection. But when possible, it would be great if more companies were actually, and I think the customer, the ultimate customer, finds it fascinating to know, well, this came from Japan. The shibori is a beautiful tie-dye from Japan, or this came from the Amazon. People are intrigued by that. So I have a feeling that's a good direction for us to go in.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this makes me think what you just said. So many of your designs and patterns are created, they're anonymous. You don't know who made them.
All of them almost.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's so fascinating. Tell us more about,
Well, for every Sonia Delaunay and Raoul Dufy, there are tens of thousands of anonymous artists of great skill. And they created in studio settings for hundreds of years. And often they worked with the guidance of the person who was running the studio, of course, and who had relationships with the clients, and they painted original designs. Now, in Paris in the 1880s, they sat in gardens and painted the flower heads, or they worked from old grandmasters, but many of them have great libraries of books, and they also have their predecessors to work from, but they are always anonymous. It's true. It's a little bit irksome because their work is often just as beautiful as anybody else's work. It's just that there's a different ego requirement for people. And some people are quite happy to just create and not sign it. There's no scribble in the corner. And other people feel that's important, and that the ultimate consumer wants to know that it was by a certain person. And of course, it enhances the value quite a bit if it's a known person. But in essence, from the sheer design point of view, I think the anonymous artists are, the sort of heroes of the last 200 or 300 years.
I just wanted to remind everybody that you can use the Q&A function to drop in questions for Peter that I will send through to him. And that leads me to my next question, which is, can you, so much of what you do is confidential. Why is that? And without being indiscreet, can you share a couple of memorable stories with clients you've had at the design library? I mean, it would be great to hear the ones you'll never forget. You have this wonderful experience of having people physically coming through your space, and I'm sure that's led to some incredible design encounters in a way.
Yeah, and I will share a couple. One of them is kind of self-effacing because it's a funny story, and and the two that I share afterwards will be Lululemon and Calvin Klein, but this one, and I have images to go with that, but this one was when I first started. It was like 1991. I was just out of the Amazon. I had no idea anything about this industry. I was completely clueless. And I was alone in the office, and the first client who came, who I liked very much, when the minute we started talking, was Betsy Johnson. And Betsy Johnson in that time was her own show, really. And she was such a wonderful wild child of creativity. And she came in and sat and said, stared out the window at Broadway and said, Peter, I just don't know what direction to go this year. I think it was 1991. I'm going to guess 1991. And I said, and I sat there thinking, I am the last person on earth who could help with this, you know? I just don't know where to start. So I threw out this statement, which was, well, you know, I think Bill Clinton is probably going to be elected. And she said, yes. And she just said, oh, I get it. It's going to be a return to the kind of quilt look and the Southern thing, and it's going to be homey. And she did, and she was off on exactly a creative tear that influenced her line. And it wasn't anything that I did or said. It was just a spark that she needed. And some designers who come to the library work the same way. Many don't. And people who have large lines to do, they send us briefs ahead of time. And we get the brief, and I'll see if I can move into this. So this is a brief that came from Lululemon. And they basically sent 2 images that was a direction that they wanted to go. We provided this, which is actually a 1961 Bianchini Ferrier from the collection we just talked about. This is their color work that they did subsequently. And that's the final product.
Wow, it's so interesting to see how it evolves.
And so generally, and to speak to your, of course, this is a hyper simplified version of it, but to speak to your thing about why is it confidential, it isn't as such confidential. We are discreet because without permission of our clients, we don't feel we have the right to share even that we work with them, but certainly not the direction that they're going. In other words, their direction is their direction, and they've honed it. It's going to determine the next year or 2 of their production. And even though we're in a privileged position because we do get these briefs, we don't tell people ever what they are. And we, you know, there are trend, as you know, there are big trend companies, and that's what they do. And we never get involved in trend. Our goal is to have everything that any professional creative would want. And so we keep and have it accessible so it can be found in a short period of time. Mm-hmm. So it's more of a just respect for the client's own intellectual property and their own direction. Some people don't care, others do. Most do, I think. Then one of my favorite stories is Francisco Costa was the head of a collection at Calvin Klein for years, and he's, in my view, one of the great creatives. He was one of the people who would come and with no particular brief, just see a couple of things and say, I can work with these and start and make something new. So he found these two swatches in the library. This was the bigger version of it. And he created a brand new fabric, and it was a die cut, laser cut, laminated on another piece, and it made a beautiful fabric that finally came out in a color trial like this.
Gorgeous.
And then he made the dress for Michelle Obama that she wore to the Nobel Peace Awards. So this is probably one of my favorite memories of a visit to the library, basically. Mm-hmm.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome. And this is my final slide of the library. This is another view, a table where, based on a brief that we've received, Julianne is pulling a collection that the client will be able to see. So when they arrive, they'll have it at their fingertips, and they can see 1,000 ideas in an hour or 2. So that's part of the reason people come is because it's a very efficient way to work.
Mm-hmm.
It's also fun. When people get there, they're like ecstatic. It's sort of like heaven for designers, you know.
I just want to share with everybody that also, again, in Peter's book, at the very end, he has more case studies with people like Nike and all sorts of clients, and going through, again, the process from inspiration to final design. And it's fascinating. I'm a designer. As a designer myself, it's just very interesting to see the evolution. So I think we're ready to take questions from everybody. We have a number that, you know, people have dropped in. And we have somebody who is asking about, you know, the history of plaid and tartan patterns. I mean, like Paisley, they say it's made its way through continents, landing in Scotland. And can you share some of your knowledge about tartans and plaids?
Well, they have, boy, have they been done everywhere also.
I mean, I'm wearing a kind of.
Exactly. It's and there, I mean, the famous plaid books that we have are named after clans. You know, the Scottish clans, each clan has a plaid. And I think that was also an emblem of, you know, who you would fight with if there was a fight, you know, and what you would wear to the party and where you wear to weddings is your clan plaid. Famous plaids from India are Madras, which I remember how stylish they were when I was in high school. Yeah. And still are, exactly. Checks and plaids are probably the most ubiquitous form out there, and they can be printed or woven, which is fascinating. And printed plaids are very nice. One of the collections we bought was from the Alsace-Lorraine part of France, and it was the mill that created for Chanel before Chanel set up their own mill. And they had an archive of fantastic things, beautiful, beautiful things. So we get to house that now, and it's beautiful. And of course, the fancy bouclés aren't done by many people, but then there were lots of flat weave plaids that were very beautiful. I should be quite upfront that I am not a historian. I wish I could say I knew more about specific things. Susan, my predecessor at the library, is definitely a historian. I'm more into the phenomenon of the flow of it. I'm into obviously I love the business. I love the working with designers, although I couldn't design something if my life depended on it. So I'm more of a curator and a acquirer and a presenter, and then a historian. And somehow the book captured the idea that you could learn a lot about pattern without writing a PhD about it, you know.
Making it accessible, yeah.
Hopefully. And then people certainly should drill down further if they want to. I wish I had more detail, but I love plaids, you know, big ones, small ones. I just can't. Obviously, it's the simplest thing to weave that there is. And then I guess the next step is a dobby, which is a little more complex, and then the jacquard. But that's about all I can say.
Yeah. Here's a more technical question, which is about restrictions on reproductions. So when when clients come to you, are they allowed to use something as is? Or do you tend to suggest changing it by a certain percentage in terms of color or size?
It's always good to change it. Not everyone does. They like it the way it is. They don't have time. And they don't technically have to change it if it's a design from the public domain, from history. In other words, no one owns the design. Nobody is there to challenge it. There are no rights to it. So what the amazing thing about the library is 99.9% of what's there is in the public domain. It's not protected by any copyright, and we don't convey copyright. because we don't own it. So we have the object. And the reason people come to us is because they won't see it anywhere else. So it's about access, and it's about the idea contained in it. Most people do change things and make it their own. And then particularly if they want to copyright their product, they change it and then copyright the new version, and it's theirs. The only danger really is if somebody else has the same pattern at the same time and both people do it the same.
Has that ever happened?
Rare. Oh, very, very rare, because there's so many millions of patterns, and we won't give the same pattern to the same person at the same time. So in fact, when we license a design or rent it, it's a 2-year time period, and for that period it disappears from the library. It's the same on Cosmos, it disappears. So we're very much a rights protected within what we can control. We protect the rights of our clients, and the design is just one company at a time.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from a librarian, which I think is an interesting one. And Lisa is interested in the online catalogs, and she's interested in I guess, the taxonomy, and how do you catalog them? You talked about it a bit briefly, but I think what's interesting in what she's asking is, do you feel there's anything missing?
Oh, we could always add, absolutely. When we get a new collection, and sometimes mid-century, for example, we just in the last year, we had 40s, we may have had 50s, but then mid-century is really different from 50s. Just like Art Deco is different from 20s and 30s. They're their own, they're something more specific. So we just established a category called mid-century, which can come from, the 40s to the 60s, or from any other time period. We file things away based on the look, not the actual date. So if somebody in 2010 paints a beautiful mid-century design, we're going to put it in with the mid-century, with the 1950s designs, because that's where it should be, basically, for our clients.
Yeah, people will go to look for it there. So you're prioritizing.
Yes.
The
exactly.
design way of entering the visual.
We're prioritizing the creative professionals' way of looking, yes. Basically. Yes. Yeah.
I have one question from Sheetal Khanna-Rabich, who has asked, given the use of companies and designers using resources such as yours. So the question is, what advice would you give to an artist or designer setting themselves up to create a portfolio of patterns for sale to the industry?
Wow. I guess pick a look that you like and develop it. Like, take it, in other words, don't try to be all things to all people, but pick your look and develop it as deeply as you can. And then find the client who wants that look, because that's what you'll be most comfortable with. That's what it'll be effortless to create, I should think. And I mean, I'm not an artist. And when we buy studio collections, which is quite often lately, they are generally a bit older. They've been maybe closed for 20 or 30 years. They're from Lyon, France, or from parts of Italy where studios were very busy, and then the world changed and so much is digital now. But first of all, I'm encouraged that somebody is creating portfolios to show, and that it isn't a digital world. I just think, find your point of view and express it, live it.
Mm-hmm. On that note, I mean, what do you think the point of view is going to be given this collective experience we're all in the middle of? What is your sense of how our creative professionals going to respond to this moment?
Well, I wish I knew. I think for at least the next year or two, everybody's going to be fairly remote. I think that our clients who had who have or could develop quickly online businesses, they could grow that, have done fine. They've done okay. The ones that relied on a store or walk in, it's been really rough. You know, if they couldn't divert their resources into an online, or if their product doesn't lend itself to that, it's harder. I think it's really hard. I think we're going to be some distance. I'm encouraged. People are coming back to our office, but one of the reasons is because it's so big and there's so much air around that people feel safe there, and we have a very strict protocol. But we're doing a great deal more with Cosmos, which is the online that you saw. Incidentally, anybody listening can log on and look at Satellite. Satellite is free access, which are all the designs from the book Patterns, my book. So Cosmos is another level because it's a rights protected level, but people can see Satellite through our website and can see and build collections and make their projects and so on without spending any money if they want to. And if they fall in love with something and they want to make a commercial product, then they can get it that way too. So I see that as growing, and it's kind of a shame because people love to work in person, and people love to touch the thing. And even if it's a gouache on paper, it's different to see the paper and then see it on a screen. So I think that as soon as we can, people will come back to doing it that way. As far as the marketplace goes and what's going to sell out there, I just have no clue. I have no idea.
Well, I'm going to end this conversation on a personal note, which is, you know, I noticed that collectors often, you know, you do this for your job, but you probably also collect other things. What are some of, are you a collector in your, you know, in your personal life? And what kinds of things do you collect?
Well, I love Amazonian art. I still have a collection of that. Pottery, textiles, wooden tools, metal tools. I love, actually, I'm a devoted collector of all sorts of tribal art, include whether it's from Africa or Indonesia. Any object that's made that's so beautiful, even though it's fun, I like functional things. So if it's functional but made beautifully, it's sort of like the thing that we should all try and strive for. And they inspire. This having things around inspires me.
Peter, thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay.
That's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you everybody for joining us. We're going to have more events all the way through September 30th. We hope you enjoyed this one. Thanks again. Goodbye.
Bye, Sagarika. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.